BRIHADARANAYAKA. The Self is the dearest of all things, and only through the Self is anything else dear. The Self is the origin of all finite happiness, but it is itself pure bliss, transcending definition. It remains unaffected by deeds, good or bad. It is beyond feeling and beyond knowledge, but it is not beyond the meditation of the sage. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is he still the same. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Lead me from the unreal to the real. Lead me from darkness to light. Lead me from death to immortality. The world existed first as seed, which as it grew and developed, took on names and forms. As a razor on its case or as fire in wood, so dwells the Self, the Lord of the universe, in all forms, even to the tips of the fingers. Yet the ignorant do not know him, for behind the names and forms he remains hidden. When one breathes, one knows him as breath. When one speaks, one knows him as speech. When one sees, one knows him as the eye. When one hears, one knows him as the ear. When one thinks, one knows him as the mind. All these are but names related to his acts, and he who worships the Self as one or another of them does not know him, for of them he is neither one nor another. Wherefore, let a man worship him as the Self, and as the Self alone. The perception which is the Self is the goal of all beings, for by knowing the Self one knows all. He who knows the Self is honored of all men and attains to blessedness. This Self, which is nearer to us than anything else, is indeed dearer than a son, dearer than wealth, dearer than all beside. Let a man worship the Self alone as dear, for if he worship the Self alone as dear, the object of his love will never perish. This universe, before it was created, existed as Brahman. I am Brahman. Thus did Brahman know himself. Knowing himself, he became the Self of all beings. Among the gods, he who awakened to the knowledge of the Self became Brahman, and the same was true among the seers. The seer Vamadeva, realizing Brahman, knew that he himself was the Self of mankind as well as of the sun. Therefore, now also, whoever realizes Brahman knows that he himself is the Self in all creatures. Even the gods cannot harm such a man, since he becomes their innermost self. Now, if a man worship Brahman, thinking Brahman is one and he another, he has not the true knowledge. The universe, before it was created, existed as Brahman. Brahman created out of himself priests and warriors, tradesmen and servants among both gods and men. Then he created the most excellent law. There is nothing higher than the law. The law is the truth. Therefore it is said that if a man speak the truth, he declares the law, and if he declare the law, he speaks the truth. The law and the truth are one. Now, if a man depart this life without knowing the kingdom of the Self, he, because of that ignorance, does not enjoy the bliss of liberation. he dies without reaching his goal. Nay, even if a man ignorant of the kingdom of the self should do virtuous deeds on earth, he would not arrive through them at everlasting life, for the effects of his deeds would finally be exhausted. Wherefore, let him know the kingdom of the self, and that alone. The virtue of him who meditates on the kingdom of the self is never exhausted, for the self is the source from which all virtue springs. The self out of which the sun rises and into which it sets, that alone do the wise make their goal. Gargiya, son of Valaka, was a good talker, but exceedingly vain. Coming one day into the presence of Ajatasattu, king of Varanasi, he accosted him with boastful speech. Gargiya, I will teach you of Brahman. Ajatasattu, indeed? Well, just for that kind proposal you should be rewarded with 1,000 cows. People nowadays flock to King Janaka to speak and hear of Brahman. I am pleased that you have come to me instead. Gargiya, he who is the being in the sun and at the same time the being in the eye, he who, having entered the body through the eye, resides in the heart and is the door and the experiencer, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as transcendental, luminous, supreme. He who meditates upon Brahman as such goes beyond all created beings and becomes the glorious ruler of all. Gargiya, the being who is in the moon and at the same time in the mind, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as infinite, clad in purity, blissful, resplendent. He who meditates upon Brahman as such lacks nothing and is forever happy. The being who is in the lightning and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as power. He who meditates upon Brahman as such becomes powerful, and his children after him. Gargiya, the being who is in the sky and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as all-pervading, changeless. He who meditates upon Brahman as such is blessed with children and with cattle. The thread of his progeny shall never be cut. Gargiya, the being who is in the wind and who at the same time is the breath within, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as the Lord, invincible and unconquerable. He who meditates upon Brahman as such becomes himself invincible and unconquerable. Gargiya, the being who is in the fire and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as forgiving. He who meditates upon Brahman as such becomes himself forgiving and his children after him. Gargiya, the being who is in the water and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as harmony. He who meditates upon Brahman as such knows only what is harmonious. Of him are born tranquil children. Gargya, the being who is in the mirror, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu, nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as effulgent. He who meditates upon Brahman as such becomes himself effulgent, and his children after him. He shines brighter than all who approach him. Gargia. The sound that follows a man as he walks, that I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu. Nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as the vital force. He who meditates upon Brahman as such reaches his full age in this world. Breath does not leave him before his time. Gargia. The being who pervades space, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu. Nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as a second self, who can never be separated from me. He who meditates upon Brahman as such is never lonely, and his followers never forsake him. Gargia. The being who dwells in the heart as intelligence, him I meditate upon as Brahman. Ajatasattu. Nay, nay, do not speak thus of Brahman, that being I worship as the Lord of Will. He who meditates upon Brahman as such achieves self-control, and his children after him. Gargia ceased speaking. Ajatasattu, continuing, questioned him. Ajatasattu. Is that all that you know of Brahman? Gargia. That is all that I know. Ajatasattu. By knowing only so much, one cannot profess to know Brahman. Gargia. Please, sir, accept me as a disciple and teach me of Brahman. Ajatasattu. It is unnatural that a Brahmin should approach a Kshatriya and a king to learn of Brahman. However, I will teach you. So saying, Ajatasattu took Gargia by the hand and rose. Then, as the two walked side by side, they came to a sleeping man. Ajatasattu to the sleeper. O thou great one, clad in white raiment, O Soma, O king! At first the man did not stir. Then, as Ajatasattu touched him, he awoke. Ajatasattu to Gargia. This man, who is a conscious, intelligent being, where was he when he was thus asleep, and how did he thus wake up? Gargia was silent. When this man, who is a conscious, intelligent being, is thus in deep sleep, he enters into the self within the lotus of the heart. Having withdrawn into himself both his senses and his mind. When his senses and his mind are thus withdrawn, he is said to be absorbed in the self. In this state he knows nothing. He enters into the 72,000 nerves which go out from the lotus of the heart. Even as a young man, or an emperor, or the best of Brahmins, when he has experienced the ecstasy of love, straightway takes sweet repose, so does a man deep in sleep find rest. But when he sleeps, but also dreams, he lives in a world of his own. He may dream that he is a king, or that he is the best of Brahmins. He may dream that he is an angel, or that he is a beast. As an emperor, having obtained the objects of enjoyment, moves about at will in his dominions, so the sleeper, gathering up the impressions of sense, compounds them into dreams according to his desires. As threads come out of the spider, as little sparks come out of the fire, so all the senses, all the worlds, all the gods, yeah, all beings issue forth from the self. His secret name is Truth of the Truth. Yajnavalkya to his wife. Maitreyi, I am resolved to give up the world and begin the life of renunciation. I wish therefore to divide my property between you and my other wife, Katyayani. Maitreyi, my lord, if this whole earth belonged to me with all its wealth, should I through its possession attain immortality? Yajnavalkya. No, your life would be like that of the rich. None can possibly hope to attain immortality through wealth. Maitreyi. Then what need have I of wealth? Please, my lord, tell me what you know about the way of immortality. Yajnavalkya. Dear to me have you always been, Maitreyi, And now you ask to learn of that truth which is nearest my heart. Come sit by me, I will explain it to you. Meditate on what I say. It is not for the sake of the husband, my beloved, that the husband is dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the wife, my beloved, that the wife is dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the children, my beloved, that the children are dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of wealth, my beloved, that wealth is dear, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the Brahmins, my beloved, that the Brahmins are held in reverence, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the Kshatriyas, my beloved, that the Kshatriyas are held in honor, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the higher worlds, my beloved, that the higher worlds are desired, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the gods, my beloved, that the gods are worshipped, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of the creatures, my beloved, that the creatures are prized, but for the sake of the self. It is not for the sake of itself, my beloved, that anything whatever is esteemed, but for the sake of the self. The self, Maitreyi, is to be known. Hear about it, reflect upon it, meditate upon it. By knowing the self, my beloved, through hearing, reflection, and meditation, one comes to know all things. Let the Brahmin ignore him who thinks that the Brahmin is different from the self. Let the Kshatriya ignore him who thinks that the Kshatriya is different from the self. Let the higher worlds ignore him who thinks that the higher worlds are different from the self. Let the gods ignore him who thinks that the gods are different from the self. Let all creatures ignore him who thinks that the creatures are different from the self. Let all ignore him who thinks that anything whatever is different from the self. The priest, the warrior, the higher worlds, the gods, the creatures, whatsoever things there be, these are the self. As when the drum is beaten, its various particular notes are not heard apart from the whole, but in the total sound all its notes are heard. As when the conch shell is blown, its various particular notes are not heard apart from the whole, but in the total sound all its notes are heard. As when the veena is played, its various particular notes are not heard apart from the whole, but in the total sound all its notes are heard. So through the knowledge of the self, pure intelligence, all things and beings are known. There is no existence apart from the self. As smoke and sparks arise from a lighted fire kindled with damp fuel, even so, Maitreyi, have been breathed forth from the Eternal all knowledge and all wisdom. What we know as the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the rest, they are the breath of the Eternal. As for water, the one center is the ocean. As for touch, the one center is the skin. As for smell, the one center is the nose. As for taste, the one center is the tongue. As for form, the one center is the eyes. As for sound, the one center is the ears. As for thought, the one center is the mind. As for divine wisdom, the one center is the heart. So for all beings, the one center is the self. As a lump of salt, when thrown into water, melts away, and the lump cannot be taken out, but wherever we taste the water, it is salty. Even so, O Maitreyi, the individual self, dissolved, is the eternal, pure consciousness, infinite and transcendent. Individuality arises by identification of the self, through ignorance with the elements, and with disappearance of consciousness of the many, in divine illumination, it disappears. Where there is consciousness of the self, individuality is no more. This is it, O my beloved, that I wanted to tell you. Maitreyi, where there is consciousness of the self, individuality is no more. This that you say, my lord, confuses me. Yajnavalkya, my beloved, let nothing I have said confuse you, but meditate well the truth that I have spoken. As long as there is duality, one sees the other, one hears the other, one smells the other, one speaks to the other, one thinks of the other, one knows the other. But when, for the illumined soul, the all is dissolved in the self, who is there to be seen by whom? Who is there to be smelled by whom? Who is there to be heard by whom? Who is there to be spoken to by whom? Who is there to be thought of by whom? Who is there to be known by whom? Ah, Maitreyi, my beloved, the intelligence which reveals all, by what shall it be revealed? By whom shall the knower be known? The self is described as not this, not that. It is incomprehensible, for it cannot be comprehended. Undecaying, for it never decays. Unattached, for it never attaches itself. Unbound, for it is never bound. By whom, O my beloved, shall the knower be known? This it is that I teach you, O Maitreyi. This is the truth of immortality. So saying, Yajnavalkya entered upon the path of renunciation. This earth is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this earth. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this earth, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This water is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this water. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this water, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This fire is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this fire. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this fire, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This air is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this air. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this air, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. The sun is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this sun. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this sun, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This space is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this space. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this space, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This moon is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this moon. The intelligent immortal being, the soul of this moon, and the intelligent immortal being, the soul in the individual being, each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. The lightning is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this lightning. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this lightning, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. This thunder is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this thunder. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this thunder, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. The ether is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this ether. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this ether, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This law is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this law. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this law, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This truth is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this truth. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this truth, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. The race of man is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for this race of man. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of this race of man, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. The self is honey for all beings, and all beings are honey for the self. The intelligent, immortal being, the soul of the self, and the intelligent, immortal being, the soul in the individual being. Each is honey to the other. Brahman is the soul in each. He indeed is the self in all. He is all. This self is the Lord of all beings, the King of all beings. As the spokes are held together in the hub and in the felly of a wheel, just so all beings and all creatures, all gods, all worlds, all lives are held together in the self. He made bodies with 2 feet, he made bodies with 4 feet. He entered into all bodies, and because he dwells within the lotus of the heart, he is known as Purusha. There's nothing that is not surrounded by him, nothing that is not filled with him. He assumed all forms. He assumed all forms to reveal himself in all forms. He, the Lord, is revealed in all forms through his Maya. He is tens, he is thousands, he is numberless. This Brahman is without cause, without effect, without inside or outside. This Brahman is the Self. Janaka, king of Videha, on a certain occasion performed a sacrifice, and in connection therewith distributed costly gifts. Among those who attended the ceremony were the wise men of Kuru and of Panchala. King Janaka observed them and wanted to find out which was the wisest. Now it happened that the king kept 1,000 cows enclosed in a pen, and between the horns of every one of them were fastened 10 gold coins. Venerable Brahmins, said King Janaka, let him who is the wisest among you take away these cows. The Brahmins dared not stir, save Yajnavalkya alone. My learned son, said Yajnavalkya to his disciple, drive home my cows. Hurrah! Cried the lad, and made for them. The rest of the Brahmins were enraged. How dare he call himself the wisest? They shouted. At last, Asvala, priest to King Janaka, accosted Yajnavalkya, saying, Yajnavalkya, are you quite sure you are the wisest among us? I bow down, replied Yajnavalkya, to the wisest, but I want those cows. Then Asvala began to question him. Asvala, Yajnavalkya, since everything connected with sacrificial rites is pervaded by death and is subject to death, by what means can the worshipper overcome death? Yajnavalkya, by knowledge of the identity between the worshipper, the fire, and the ritual world. For the ritual world is indeed the worshipper, and the ritual world is the fire, and the fire, which is one with Brahman, is the worshipper. This knowledge leads to liberation. This knowledge leads one beyond death. Asvala held his peace, but Atarbhaga asked, Yajnavalkya, everything is the food of death. Is there any power for which death is food? Indeed, yes. Fire devours everything, and fire again is the food of water. Similarly, there is a death to death. The knower of the truth of Brahman overcomes death. Atarbhaga, Yajnavalkya, when such an one gives up his body, do his perspective faculties along with his mind go out of him, or do they not? Yajnavalkya, they do not. They merge in the final cause, the self. The body lies lifeless, inflated, and swollen. Atarbhaga held his peace. Then Ushasta asked, Yajnavalkya, what is the ultimate, the immediate Brahman, Brahman himself alone, directly realized as such, the self which dwells within all? Yajnavalkya, pointing to his heart, this is thyself which is within all. Ushasta, which self, O Yajnavalkya, is within all? Yajnavalkya, that which breatheth in is thyself, which is within all. That which breatheth down is thyself, which is within all. That which diffuses breath is thyself, which is within all. That which breatheth out is thyself, which is within all. Again I reply, this thyself, which is within all. Ushasta, as one might say, in distinguishing a cow from a horse, that the cow is the animal that walks, and the horse is the animal that runs. Exactly so simple, so clear, a wise one, has been your teaching about Brahman. But tell me, I ask again, who is the ultimate, the immediate Brahman? Brahman himself alone, directly realized as such, the self which dwells within all? Yajnavalkya, this thyself which is within all. Ushasta, which self, O Yajnavalkya, is within all? Thou canst not see the seer of the sight, thou canst not hear the hearer of the sound, thou canst not think the thinker of the thought, and thou canst not know the knower of the known. Again I reply, this thyself which is within all, anything that is not the self perishes. Ushasta held his peace. Kahola asked, Yajnavalkya, what is the ultimate, the immediate Brahman, Brahman himself alone, directly realized as such, the self which dwells within all? Yajnavalkya, this thyself which is within all. Kahola, which self, O Yajnavalkya, is within all? Yajnavalkya, that which is beyond hunger, thirst, grief, delusion, decay, and death. Having realized this self, the sages renounce the craving for progeny, wealth, existence in the other worlds, and live the life of mendicants. The craving for progeny leads to the craving for wealth, and the craving for wealth to the craving for existence in the other worlds. Thus, there are two cravings for a life of enjoyment here, and craving for a life of greater enjoyment hereafter. Therefore, should a sage, when he has fully attained the knowledge of the self, desire to live with that knowledge as his only refuge. When he has fully attained that knowledge and realized it as his only refuge, he should devote himself exclusively to contemplation of the self. He alone is the true knower of Brahman, who directs his mind towards the self and shuns all other thoughts as distractions. How does such a knower of Brahman act and conduct himself? Whatever he may do or howsoever he may conduct himself, he is free from craving and is forever established in the knowledge of Brahman. Anything that is not the self perishes. Kaula held his peace. Udalaka spoke. Yagnavalkya, we live as students in Madra, in the house of Kapia, whose wife was once possessed by a Gandharva, a celestial singer. We asked the Gandharva who he was. He replied that he was Gabanda, and proceeded to question Kapia thus: Dost thou know that thread whereon this life, the next life, and all beings are strung together? Kapia did not know. The Gandharva continued: Dost thou know that inner ruler who controls from within this life, the next life, and all beings? Kapia did not know. The Gandharva then said: He who knows that thread and that inner ruler knows Brahman, knows the worlds, knows the gods, knows the Vedas, knows the creatures, knows the self, knows all things. I myself know these things that the Gandharva taught. Yagnavalkya, if thou, without knowing that thread and that inner ruler, take the cows that belong only to the wisest, accursed shalt thou be. Yagnavalkya, I know that thread and that inner ruler. Udalaka, anybody can say, I know, I know. Tell us what you know. Yagnavalkya, the subtle principle of life is that thread whereon this life and the next life and all beings are strung. Hence, when a man dies, they say his limbs are loosed, for while he lives, they are held together by that principle of life. Udalaka, that is true, Yagnavalkya. Now speak of the inner ruler. Yagnavalkya, he who dwells on earth, but is separate from the earth, whom the earth does not know, whose body the earth is, and who controls the earth from within. He, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in water, but is separate from water, whom water does not know, whose body is, and who controls water from within. He, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in fire, but is separate from fire, whom fire does not know, whose body fire is, and who controls fire from within. He, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in the sky, in the air, in heaven, in the four quarters, in the sun, in the moon, in the stars, in ether, in darkness, in light, but is separate from them, whom none of them knows, whose body they are, and who controls them from within. He, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in all beings but is separate from all beings, whom no being knows, whose body all beings are, and who controls all beings from within. He, the self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in odor, speech, sight, hearing, and touch, but is separate from them, whom odor, speech, sight, hearing, and touch do not know, whose body is odor, speech, sight, hearing, and touch are, and who controls them all from within. He, the Self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in the mind but is separate from the mind, whom the mind does not know, whose body the mind is, and who controls the mind from within. He is the Self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. He who dwells in the intellect, but is separate from the intellect, whom the intellect does not know, whose body the intellect is, and who controls the intellect from within. He, the Self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. Unseen, but the seer, unheard, but the hearer, unthinkable, but the thinker, unknown, but the knower. There is no seer but he, there is no hearer but he, there is no other but he, there is no knower but he. He, the Self, is the inner ruler, the immortal. Anything that is not the Self perishes. Udalaka held his peace. Then arose Gargi, the daughter of Vashnu, and addressed the sages. Revered Brahmins, I shall ask Yagnavalkya 2 questions. If he is able to answer them, no one among you can ever defeat him. He will be the great expounder of the truth of Brahman. Yagnavalkya. Okay, ask, O Gargi. Gargi. Yagnavalkya, as the son of the warrior from Kasi or Videha, might string his loosened bow, and with 2 deadly arrows in his hand rise to give battle. Even so have I risen to fight thee with 2 questions. Yagnavalkya. Ask, O Gargi. Yagnavalkya. That of which they say that it is above heaven and below the earth, which is between heaven and Karth as well, and which was, is, and shall be. Tell me, in what was it woven, warp and woof? Yagnavalkya. That of which they say, O Gargi, that it is above heaven and below the earth, which is between heaven and earth as well, and which was, is, and shall be, that is woven, warp, and woof in the ether. Gargi. Thou hast answered my first question. I bow to thee, O Yagnavalkya. Be ready now to answer my second question. Yagnavalkya. Ask, O Gargi. Gargi. In whom is that ether woven, warp, and woof? Yagnavalkya. The seers, O Gargi, call him Akshara, the changeless reality. He is neither gross nor fine, neither short nor long, neither hot nor cold, neither light nor dark, neither of nature of air nor of the nature of ether. He is without relations, he is without taste or smell, without eyes, ears, speech, mind, vigor, breath, and mouth. He is without measure, he is without inside or outside. He enjoys nothing, nothing enjoys him. At the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, sun and moon hold their courses. At the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, heaven and earth keep their positions. At the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, moments, hours, days and nights, fortnights and months, seasons and years, all follow their paths. At the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, rivers issuing from the snowy mountains flow on, some eastward, some westward, others in other directions. Hey, O Gargi, who in this world, without knowing this Akshara, offers oblations, performs sacrifices, practices austerities, even though for many thousands of years gains little, His offerings and practices are perishable. He, Gargi, who departs this life without knowing the imperishable, is pitiable. But he, O Gargi, who departs this life knowing the Akshara, is wise. This Akshara, O Gargi, is unseen, but is the seer, is unheard, but is the hearer, is unthinkable, but is the thinker, is unknown, but is the knower. There is no seer but he, there is no hearer but he, there is no thinker but he, there is no knower but he. In Akshara, verily, O Gargi, the ether is woven, warp and woof. Gargi. Revered Brahmins, well may you feel blessed if you get off with bowing before him. No one will defeat Yajnavalkya, expounder of the truth of Brahman. Gargi held her peace. Yajnavalkya addressed the sages. Revered Brahmins, ask me questions if you will, any one of you in the assembly or all of you. Or if any one of you so desires, I will question him, or I will question all of you. But the Brahmins held their peace. Om. On a certain occasion, Janaka, king of Videha, having seated himself to give audience, saw the sage Yajnavalkya among his visitors and accosted him. Janaka, Yajnavalkya, what brings you here? Do you come for cattle or for philosophy? Yajnavalkya, for both, your majesty. I wish to hear what your teachers may have taught you. Janaka, Yitva taught me that the word is Brahman. Yajnavalkya, as one who in childhood was instructed adequately, first by his mother and then by his father, and after that was initiated into the sacred mysteries by a sage, as such an one should teach, so has Yitva taught you the truth when he said that the word is Brahman. For what could a person achieve without the word? But did he tell you about the abode and support of this word Brahman? Janaka, no, he did not. Yajnavalkya, then you have been only partly taught. Janaka, do you then teach me, O Yajnavalkya? Yajnavalkya, the organ of speech is its abode, and ether, the primal cause of the universe, is its eternal support. Meditate upon the word as identical with knowledge. Janaka, what is knowledge, Yajnavalkya? Yajnavalkya, the word is knowledge, your majesty. For through the word a friend is known, and likewise all knowledge, spiritual or otherwise. Through the word is gained knowledge of this world and of the next. Through the word is obtained knowledge of all creatures. The word, your majesty, is the supreme Brahman. Janaka, I give you 1,000 cows with a bull as big as an elephant for teaching me. Yajnavalkya, my father was of the opinion that one should not accept any reward from a disciple without fully instructing him. I wish to know what anyone else may have taught you. Janaka, Udanka taught me that primal energy is Brahman. He did not tell me about its abode and support. Yajnavalkya, breath is its abode and ether its support. It should be meditated upon as dear, for life is indeed dear. The primal energy is Brahman. Tell me what more you have been taught. Janaka, Barku taught me that sight is Brahman, but he did not teach me its abode and support. Yajnavalkya, the eye is its abode and ether its support. It should be meditated upon as truth, for it is by sight that objects are known. Sight is Brahman. What more have you learned? Janaka, Gardabhiviti taught me that hearing is Brahman. Yajnavalkya, the ear is its abode and ether its support. It should be meditated upon as limitless, for space is limitless, and sound is carried by space. Hearing is Brahman. Janaka, Satyakama taught me that the mind is Brahman. Yajnavalkya. The mind is its abode and ether, its support. It should be meditated upon as happiness, for by the mind alone is happiness experienced. Mind is Brahman. Janaka. Vidakta taught me that the heart is Brahman. The heart is its abode and ether, its support. It should be meditated upon as the resting place. For all beings find rest in the heart. The heart is Brahman. Janaka, descending from his throne and humbly addressing the sage. I bow down to you, Yajnavalkya. Please teach me. Yajnavalkya. Your Majesty, as a person wishing to make a long journey, furnishing himself with a chariot or a boat, so have you equipped your mind with sacred wisdom. You are honorable and wealthy, and you have studied the Vedas and learned the Upanishads. Whither then shall you go when you leave this body? Janaka, I do not know, revered sir. Yajnavalkya, I will tell you where you will go. Janaka, tell me, please. Yajnavalkya, Inda is the self identified with the physical self. Vidash, the physical world, is his wife, the object of his environment. The space within the heart is that place of union and dream, when the self is identified with a subtle body or mind. The self in dreamless sleep is identified with a vital force. Beyond this is the Supreme Self, he that has been described as not this, not that. He is incomprehensible, for he cannot be comprehended. He is undecaying, for he never decays. He is unattached, for he does not attach himself. He is unfettered, for nothing can fetter him. He is never hurt. You have attained him who is free from fear, O Janaka, and free from birth and death. Janaka. May that fearlessness come to you who teach us fearlessness. I bow down to you. Behold, this empire of Videha and I myself are at your service. Once when Yajnavalkya came to the court of King Janaka, the king welcomed him with a question. Janaka. Yajnavalkya, what serves as the light for man? Yajnavalkya. The light of the sun, your majesty. For by the light of the sun man sits, goes out, does his work, and returns home. Janaka. True, indeed, Yajnavalkya. But when the sun has set, what serves then as the light? Yajnavalkya. The moon is then the light. Janaka. When the sun has set, O Yajnavalkya, and the moon has set, what serves then as the light? Yajnavalkya. The fire is then the light. Janaka. When the sun has set, O Yajnavalkya, and the moon has set, and the fire has gone out, what serves then as the light? Yajnavalkya. Sound is then the light. For with sound alone as his light, man sits, goes out, does his work, and returns home. Even though he cannot see his own hand, yet when he hears a sound, he moves towards it. Janaka. True, indeed. O Yajnavalkya, when the sun has set, and the moon has set, and the fire has gone out, and no sound is heard, what serves then as his light? Yajnavalkya. The self indeed is his light. For by the light of the self man sits, moves about, does his work, and when his work is done, he rests. Janaka. Who is that self? Yajnavalkya. The self-luminous being who dwells within the lotus of the heart, surrounded by the senses and sense organs, and who is the light of the intellect, is that self. Becoming identified with the intellect, he moves to and from, through birth and death, between this world and the next. Becoming identified with the intellect, the self appears to be thinking, appears to be moving. While the mind is dreaming, the self also appears to be dreaming, and to be beyond the next world as well as this. When man, the individual soul, is born and assumes relationship with the body and sense organs, he becomes associated with the evils of the world. When at death he gives up the body, he leaves all evils behind. There are two states for man, the state in this world and the state in the next. There is also a third state, the state intermediate between these two, which can be linked to dream. While in the intermediate state, a man experiences both the other states, that in this world and that in the next, and the manner thereof is as follows. When he dies, he lives only in the subtle body on which are left the impressions of his past deeds, and of these impressions he is aware, illumined as they are by the pure light of the self. Thus, it is that in the intermediate state he experiences the first state, or that of life in the world. Again, while in the intermediate state, he foresees both the evils and the blessings that will yet come to him, as these are determined by his conduct, good and bad, upon the earth, and by the character in which this conduct has resulted. Thus, it is that in the intermediate state he experiences the second state, or that of life in the world to come. In the intermediate state there are no real chariots, no horses, no roads, but by the light of the self he creates chariots and horses and roads. There are no real blessings, nor joys, nor pleasures, but he creates blessings, joys, and pleasures. There are no real ponds, nor lakes, nor rivers, but he creates ponds and lakes and rivers. He is the creator of all these out of the impressions left by his past deeds. Regarding the different states of consciousness, it is written, while one is in the state of dream, the golden self-luminous being, the self within, makes the body to sleep, though he himself remains forever awake and watches by his own light the impressions of deeds that have been left upon the mind. Thereafter, associating himself again with the consciousness of the organs of sense, the self causes the body to awake. While one is in the state of dream, the golden self-luminous being, the self within, the immortal one, keeps alive the house of flesh with the help of the vital force, but at the same time walks out of this house. The eternal goes wherever he desires. The self-luminous being assumes manifold forms, high and low in the world of dreams. He seems to be enjoying the pleasure of love, or to be laughing with friends, or to be looking at terrifying spectacles. Everyone is aware of the experiences. No one sees the experiencer. Some say that dreaming is but another form of waking, for what a man experiences while awake, he experiences again in his dreams. Be that as it may, the self in dreams shines by his own light. Janaka, revered sir, I offer you 1,000 cattle. Instruct me further for the sake of my liberation. Yajnavalkya, the self, having in dreams tasted enjoyment, gone hither and thither, experienced both good and evil, attains to the state of dreamless sleep. Then again he comes back to dreams. Whatever he may experience in dreams does not affect him, for the true nature of the self remains forever unaffected. Janaka, so it is indeed, Yajnavalkya. I offer you another 1,000 cattle, revered sir. Speak on for the sake of my liberation. Yajnavalkya, the self having in dreams tasted enjoyment, gone hither and thither, experienced good and evil, hastens back to the state of waking from which he started. Whatever he may experience in dream does not affect him, for the true nature of the self remains forever unaffected. Janaka, so it is indeed, Yajnavalkya. Another 1,000 cattle shall be yours, revered sir. Speak on for the sake of my liberation. Yajnavalkya, the self, having in wakefulness enjoyed the pleasures of sense and gone hither and thither, experienced good and evil, hastens back again to his dreams. As a large fish moves from one bank of a river to the other, so does the self move between dreaming and waking. As a hawk or a falcon flying in the sky becomes tired and stretching his wings comes back to its nest, so does the self hasten to that state where, deep in sleep, he desires no more desires and dreams no more dreams. Indeed, the self in his true nature is free from craving, free from evil, free from fear. As a man in the embrace of his loving wife knows nothing that is without, nothing that is within, so man in union with the self knows nothing that is without and nothing that is within, for in that state all desires are satisfied. The self is his only desire, he is free from craving, he goes beyond sorrow. Then father is no father, mother is no mother. Worlds disappear, gods disappear, scriptures disappear. The thief is no more, the murderer is no more, castes are no more. No more is there monk or hermit. The self is then untouched, either by good or by evil, and the sorrows of the heart are turned into joy. He does not see, nor smell, nor taste, nor speak, nor hear, nor think, nor touch, nor know, for there is nothing separate from him, there is no second. Yet he can see, for sight and he are one. Yet he can smell, for smelling and he are one. Yet he can taste, for taste and he are one. Yet he can speak, for speech and he are one. Yet he can hear, for hearing and he are one. Yet he can think, for thinking and he are one. Yet he can touch, for touching and he are one. Yet he can know, for knowing and he are one. Eternal is the light of consciousness, immortal is the self. When there is another, then one sees another, smells another, tastes another, speaks to another, hears another, thinks of another, touches and knows another. Pure like crystal water is that self, the only seer, the one without a second. He is the kingdom of Brahman, man's highest goal, supreme treasure, greatest bliss. Creatures who live within the bonds of ignorance experience but a small portion of his infinite being. Janaka, you shall have still another 1,000 cattle. Speak on, revered sir, for the sake of my liberation. Yajnavalkya, the self, having in dreams enjoyed the pleasures of sense, gone hither and thither, experienced good and evil, hastens back to the state of waking from which he started. As a man passes from dream to wakefulness, so does he pass at death from this life to the next. When a man is about to die, the subtle body, mounted by the intelligent self, groans, as a heavily laden cart groans under its burden. When his body becomes thin through old age or disease, the dying man separates himself from his limbs, even as a mango or a fig or a banyan fruit separates itself from its stalk, and by the same way that he came, he hastens to his new abode, and there assumes another body in which to begin a new life. When his body grows weak, and he becomes apparently unconscious, the dying man gathers his senses about him, and completely withdrawn their powers, descends into his heart. No more does he see form or color without. He neither sees nor smells nor tastes. He does not speak, he does not hear, he does not think, he does not know, for all the organs detaching themselves from his physical body unite with his subtle body. Then the point of his heart, where the nerves join, is lighted by the light of the self, and by that light he departs either through the eye or through the gate of the skull, or through some other aperture of the body. When he thus departs, life departs, and when life departs, all the functions of the vital principle depart. The self remains conscious, and conscious the dying man goes to his abode. The deeds of his life and the impressions they leave behind follow him. As a leech, having reached the end of a blade of grass, takes hold of another blade and draws itself to it, so the self, having left this body behind it unconscious, takes hold of another body and draws himself to it. As a goldsmith, taking an old gold ornament, molds it into another, newer and more beautiful, so the self, having given up the body and left it unconscious, takes on a newer and better form, either that of the fathers, or that of the celestial singers, or that of the gods, or that of other beings heavenly or earthly. The self is verily Brahman. Through ignorance it identifies itself with what is alien to it, and appears to consist of intellect, understanding, life, sight, hearing, earth, water, air, ether, fire, desire, and the absence of desire, anger, and the absence of anger, righteousness, and the absence of righteousness. It appears to be all things, now one, now another. As a man acts, so does he become. A man of good deeds becomes good. A man of evil deeds becomes evil. A man becomes pure through pure deeds, impure through impure deeds. As a man's desire is, so is his destiny. For as his desire is, so is his will. As his will is, so is his deed. And as his deed is, so is his reward, whether good or bad. A man acts according to the desires to which he clings. After death he goes to the next world, bearing in his mind the subtle impressions of his deeds. And after reaping there the harvest of his deeds, he returns again to this world of action. Thus he who has desires continues subject to rebirth. But he in whom desire is stilled suffers no rebirth. After death, having attained to the highest, desiring only the self, he goes to no other world. Realizing Brahman, he becomes Brahman. When all the desires which once entered into his heart have been driven out by divine knowledge, the mortal attaining to Brahman becomes immortal. As the slough of a snake lies cast off on an anthill, so lies the body of a man at death, while he, freed from the body, becomes one with the immortal spirit, Brahman, the light eternal. Janaka, Sir, again, I give you 1,000 cows, speak on, that I may be liberated. Yajnavalkya, the path of liberation is subtle, and hard, and long. I myself am walking in it. Nay, I have reached the end. By this path alone, the wise, the knowers of Brahman, attain him while living and achieve final liberation at death. Other worlds there are, joyless, enveloped in darkness. To these worlds after death go those who are unwise, who know not the self. When a man has realized the self, the pure, the immortal, the blissful, what craving can be left in him that he should take to himself another body full of suffering to satisfy it? He that has once known the glory of the self within the ephemeral body, that stumbling block to enlightenment, knows that the self is one with Brahman, Lord and Creator of all. Brahman may be realized while yet one dwells in the ephemeral body. To fail to realize him is to live in ignorance, and therefore to be subject to birth and death. The knowers of Brahman are immortal. Others, knowing him not, continue in the bonds of grief. He who with spiritual eye directly perceives the self-effulgent being, the Lord of all that was, is, and shall be, he indeed is without fear, and causes fear in none. He who knows Brahman to be the life of life, the eye of the eye, the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, he indeed comprehends fully the cause of all causes. By the purified mind alone is Brahman perceived. In Brahman there is no diversity. He who sees diversity goes from death to death. Brahman can be apprehended only as knowledge itself. Knowledge that is one with reality, inseparable from it. For he is beyond all proof, beyond all instruments of thought. The eternal Brahman is pure, unborn, subtler than the subtlest, greater than the greatest. Let therefore the wise aspirant, knowing Brahman to be the supreme goal, so shape his life and his conduct that he may attain to him. Let him not seek to know him by arguments, for arguments are idle and vain. Verily is Brahman the great unborn that dwells within the lotus of the heart, surrounded by the senses. He is the intellect of the intellect, protector of all, king of all, lord of all. Good works do not make him more, nor do evil works make him less. Lord, king, protector of all, he transcends the three worlds. Devotees seek to know him by study, by sacrifice, by continence, by austerity, by detachment. To know him is to become a seer. Desiring to know him, and him alone, monks renounce the world. Realizing the glory of the self, the sages of old craved not sons nor daughters. What have we to do with sons and daughters, they asked, we who have known the self, we who have achieved the supreme goal of existence. No longer desiring progeny, nor wealth, nor life in other worlds, they entered upon the path of complete renunciation. Craving for progeny leads to craving for wealth, and craving for wealth leads to craving for life in other worlds. Two cravings there are, the craving for a life of pleasure in this world, and the craving for a life of greater pleasure in other worlds. The self is to be described as not this, not that. It is incomprehensible, for it cannot be comprehended, undecaying, for it never decays, unattached, for it never attaches itself, unfettered, for it is never bound. He who knows the self is unaffected, whether by good or by evil. Never do such thoughts come to him as, I have done an evil thing, or I have done a good thing. Both good and evil he has transcended, and he is therefore troubled no more by what he may or may not have done. The eternal glory of the knower of Brahman, beginningless and endless, revealed by divine knowledge, is neither increased nor decreased by deeds. Let a man therefore seek to obtain it, since having obtained it, he can never be touched by evil. Self-controlled is he who knows the self, tranquil, poised, free from desire. Absorbed in meditating upon it, he sees it within his own soul, and he sees all beings in it. Evil touches him not, troubles him not, for in the fire of his divine knowledge all evil is burned away. Freed from evil, freed from desire, freed from doubt, he becomes a knower of Brahman. This, O king, is the truth of Brahman. Do thou attain to it. Janaka, most revered sir, I offer you the empire of Videha, and myself with it, to be your servant. Yajnavalkya, the self, the great unborn, the undecaying, the undying, the immortal, the fearless, is in very truth Brahman. He who knows Brahman is without fear. He who knows Brahman becomes Brahman. Gods, men, and asuras, all three descendants of Prajapati, lived with him for a time as students. Then the gods said, Teach us, sir. In reply, Prajapati uttered one syllable, Da. Then he said, Have you understood? They answered, Yes, we have understood. You said to us, Dhammayata, be self-controlled. Yes, agreed Prajapati, you have understood. Then the man said, Teach us, sir. Prajapati uttered the same syllable, Da. Then he said, Have you understood? They answered, Yes, we have understood. You said to us, Datta, be charitable. Yes, agreed Prajapati, you have understood. Then the Asura said, Teach us, sir. Prajapati uttered the same syllable, Da. Then he said, Have you understood? They said, Yes, we have understood. You told us, Dayadvan, be compassionate. Yes, agreed Prajapati, you have understood. The storm cloud thunders, Da, Da, Da. Be self-controlled, be charitable, be compassionate.